A sealed envelope, encrypted coordinates, a dimly lit room at Fort Meade, Maryland. Old wood, cracks in the walls, the kind of place that smells like Cold War paranoia and burnt coffee. A hand moves across paper, sketching. Lines become shapes, shapes become structures. The person holding the pencil has never been to this place. He's never seen it, but they're drawing it anyway. Because some people believe consciousness has no borders, no walls, no distance. And the CIA spent $20 million to find out if that was true. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13. I am your host, Matt, and tonight we are diving into one of the strangest chapters in American intelligence history. A chapter that involves psychic spies, coordinate telepathy, and a government program that somehow convinced people with PhDs and security clearances to try reading minds for 2 decades. We are talking about a project that attempted to weaponize remote viewing, which is the alleged ability to perceive distant locations using only the power of the mind. And what we're going to cover tonight is the Cold War context, why the CIA got spooked enough to fund psychics in the first place, and then the mechanics, how remote viewing actually works, at least according to the people running it. And we'll walk through the program's operational years, the name changes, the alleged hits, and then the big one, the Mars exploration session from 1984, where a viewer claimed to contact an ancient civilization a million years in the past. We're going to look at the believers versus the skeptics, the 1995 evaluation that killed the program, and we're going to end with the weirdest tangents, the gateway process, galactic federations, and even moon bases. This is the Stargate program. Now, before we get into the history, I want to put you in the shoes of someone there. It's 1984, Fort Meade, Maryland. You're sitting in a chair inside a room that smells faintly of mildew and old pine. The fluorescent light overhead hums at a frequency just below notice, sound that your brain has already decided to ignore. The floor is hard wood, it's worn smooth in the places where people have sat exactly where you're sitting now. The walls are thin, and you can hear the wind outside pressing against them. And there's a table in front of you, with a notepad and a pencil. And across from you sits a monitor. A calm voice, a neutral face, someone trained to ask questions without leading you anywhere. Their job is to keep you on the signal without telling you what the signal is. You don't know the target, and that's the point. The monitor places a sealed envelope on the table. They've read what's inside, coordinates, a destination, but they haven't told you, and they won't, not yet. Not until the session is over and the tape recorder has captured everything you said. And the monitor speaks. Your attention is directed to the coordinates in the envelope. Begin. You close your eyes and you breathe. In the training, they told you about the Matrix. Now, not the movie, but the concept. A universal information pool. A substrate of the consciousness that connects all things, all times, all places. They told you that your rational mind is the enemy here. Your intelligence, your experience, your knowledge of geography and architecture, all of it is a threat. Your brain wants to help, and that's exactly the problem. The moment your brain starts guessing, the signal dies under the noise of your own imagination. They called it analytical overlay, AOL, and not the internet AOL. It's the brain's compulsive need to make sense of things before it fully understands them. So you breathe, you silence the guesser, you wait for the signal. Your hand moves, not because you told it to, before your conscious thought catches up, before you've decided anything. The pencil makes a mark. It's a curved line, then a horizontal one. Then the pencil pauses, hovering like it's waiting for something to catch up to it. That's the ideogram, the energetic signature of the target, arriving through the autonomic nervous system before the brain has time to interfere. The monitor prompts you, describe your initial impressions. And you try. Dry, vast, stone, something elevated, massively so. The scale is wrong in a way you can't explain. The shapes you're sensing aren't the shapes you know. They're too large, too deliberate, as if something enormous was constructed here with intent and then abandoned. You keep your hand moving. The pencil describes forms you're not consciously inventing. Geometric, smooth in some places, rough in others, carved. And then something shifts. The signal changes quality. It's not just terrain anymore. It's not just structure. There's something else. A presence in the impression. Diffuse but unmistakable. The way you can sense a person standing behind you in a dark room without seeing them. A low-grade awareness bleeding through the signal. You tell the monitor, there's something here, something that, and you pause. Something that perceives. The monitor stays neutral. Can you describe it? You can't. Not precisely. They're tall. That's what the impression tells you. Thin, philosophical, not afraid, but waiting. The world around them is dying and they know it. And they're waiting for something that may have already left. And then the impression clarifies, sharpens, just for a moment. Whatever you're looking at is looking back. That's what these sessions were like, or at least that's what the people who ran them claimed. What we know for certain is that the US government funded this process, funded it seriously, and classified it at the highest level, and briefed Congress on its results for over 20 years. To understand how the United States ended up in that room with that pencil chasing signals from the unconscious mind, we have to go back to 1970. The Cold War is in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in an arms race. Nuclear, conventional, technological, spy satellites are orbiting overhead. Human networks are running double agents in Moscow and DC. The Cuban Missile Crisis is less than a decade in the rearview mirror, and Vietnam is raging. Trust is at an all-time low, and paranoia is the default setting for both superpowers. Everything is about information advantage. Who knows what first? Who sees what the other side is hiding? And then, American intelligence picks up a report that changes the game entirely. The Soviet Union is spending approximately 60 million rubles a year on parapsychological research. Psychotronics, mind control, telepathy, remote viewing, the works. Now, to understand why this mattered, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a U.S. intelligence planner in 1970. You are sitting in a conference room at Langley or the Pentagon. You've got satellite photos, SIGINT intercepts, agent reports, and you're tracking missile silos, submarine movements, troop deployments. Everything is tangible. Everything is physical. And then someone drops a file on your desk that says the Soviets are funding psychics. And your first reaction is probably laughter. Maybe you roll your eyes. Come on, psychics? Really? But then you think about it. And you think about what you don't know. You think about the fact that the Soviets have surprised you before. Sputnik, the hydrogen bomb, the speed of their ICBM development. You think about the fact that intelligence is all about asymmetric advantage. Finding ways to see what the other guy can't hide. And suddenly, it's not so funny anymore. Because if you're a U.S. intelligence planner in 1970, the strategic logic is brutal and simple. You can't afford not to believe the Soviets might be onto something. If there's even a 1% chance that an adversary has developed a capability to read minds, influence targets remotely, or perceive classified installations without physical access, you need insurance. You need to know if it's real, and if it is real, you need your own program to match it. The fear wasn't just espionage. It was what some officials called a psychic Pearl Harbor, a scenario where the enemy could strike using methods you didn't even know existed. Imagine the nightmare scenario: Soviet psychics remotely viewing the layout of NORAD, influencing the minds of American leaders during critical negotiations, sabotaging equipment, missiles, submarines, communication systems, without ever setting foot on U.S. soil. It sounds a little absurd now, but in the paranoid calculus of Cold War intelligence, Absurdity was a luxury you couldn't afford. The Soviets had proven themselves capable of technological leaps that seemed impossible until they weren't. So when intelligence reports suggested they were investing heavily in the paranormal, the question wasn't, is this real? The question was, can we afford to assume it's not real? And the answer was no. So in 1972, the CIA initiated funding for a project called SCANATE, SCANATE, short for Scan by Coordinate, at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. The goal was deceptively simple: determine whether remote viewing was real, and if so, whether it could be operationalized for intelligence collection. But the justification wasn't just Soviet fear. There was also a second, more concrete problem, one that drove strategic planners further than pure paranoia ever could: the hard target problem. During the Cold War, many Soviet installations were what intelligence agencies called hard targets, buried deep underground, located in closed cities completely inaccessible to foreigners, shielded by layers of sophisticated counterintelligence. Satellite reconnaissance had fundamental limits. Weather could obscure targets, orbital patterns were predictable, which meant the Soviets knew when to hide things. And most critically, you can't photograph what's beneath the ground. HUMINT, H-U-M-I-N-T, was even riskier. Getting an agent into a closed Soviet city was nearly impossible. And if you did manage it, the odds of that agent being caught, tortured, and executed were extremely high. Remote viewing was pitched as a solution, a non-technological workaround. As one CIA official reportedly put it, a hell of a cheap radar system that could penetrate any barrier. No satellites, no agents, no risk of international incident, just a person in a room, pencil in hand, sketching a target they'd never seen. Now, the early SRI projects attracted CIA and even NASA and JPL sponsorship by publishing initial remote viewing and psychokinesis results in mainstream technical journals. This wasn't fringe pseudoscience published in occult magazines. This was peer-reviewed work appearing in places that scientists actually read. That gave the program just enough credibility to keep the funding flowing. But credibility in the lab is one thing. Operational utility, actual usable intelligence, is another. And that question would haunt the program for the next 2 decades. So let's talk about what remote viewing actually is, or at least what the people running the program said it was. Remote viewing, as practiced at SRI and later at Fort Meade, was not your Hollywood psychic with a crystal ball. It wasn't a Ouija board or seances. It was a structured, protocol-driven process designed to minimize subjective imagination and produce replicable results. The theoretical foundation came from a man named Ingo Swann, often called the father of remote viewing. Now, Swann worked with physicist Harold Puthoff at SRI, and they developed what was called the Coordinate Remote Viewing, or CRV. Now, here's the theory as laid out in declassified CIA training documents. There exists a universal information pool. Swann called it the Matrix, a kind of cosmic database embedded in the unconscious mind. The Matrix contains all information about all things across all time and space. It knows no boundaries, no limitations. It's the universal hard drive, and everyone is plugged into it. They just don't know how to access it. During a remote viewing session, the viewer's autonomic nervous system responds to a signal line radiating from the matrix. This signal manifests as an ideogram, a spontaneous mark on paper that captures the essential energetic signature of the target. Think of it like your hand drawing something before your brain knows what it's drawing. And the viewer's job is to pull that unconscious signal through specific Lyman thresholds, barriers between the unconscious and conscious mind, and translate it into usable data. The process is delicate. Anything can interfere: sickness, hunger, fatigue, even the viewer's own logical brain trying to help by guessing what the target is. That's called analytical overlay, or AOL, the brain's tendency to misidentify psychic data using familiar patterns. A classic example: the viewer gets a signal that feels round and metallic, and their brain immediately jumps to a water tower. But the actual target is a radar dish. That's AOL, the rational mind screwing up the psychic signal before it has a chance to form. To combat this, the sessions used a monitor, which was kind of a co-pilot who kept the viewer focused on the signal line. They asked open-ended prompts and helped navigate AOL without leading them toward a specific answer. Standard operating procedure kept feedback, the actual target, away from the viewer until after evaluation to reduce queuing and maintain the integrity of the session. The training broke into 6 stages, each increasing in complexity. Stage 1 was basic terrain discrimination: mountains, water, deserts, combined with encrypted coordinates. And Stage 2 moved into sensory impressions: color, smell, temperature, texture. After that, Stage 3 addressed dimension and spatial relationships. Stage 4 reached for abstract concepts and function, and Stages 5 and 6 were advanced work: layered information, complex targets, moving through time and distance. The entire training program took approximately 6 months, with movement to the next stage dependent on successful completion of the previous one. You could not move to Stage 5 until you had completed fully Stage 4. And the people running this weren't amateurs. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff were both physicists. Their published work attracted institutional credibility. And then there were the viewers themselves. People like Joseph McMoneagle, an Army intelligence officer who became one of the longest-serving viewers at Fort Meade. Uri Geller. Now, he's a celebrity psychic, and he was tested under CIA-sponsored SRI protocols in the 1970s. Now, Uri Geller, you might remember as the guy who could bend spoons with his mind. The program claimed a minimum accuracy threshold of around 65% in lab-style trials. Whether or not those numbers were real or how they were measured would become a central point of contention in the 1995 evaluation. What's not debated is that the US government took the methodology seriously enough to fund it for over 2 decades. Now, the history of the Stargate program is a bureaucratic labyrinth. It's a maze of code names, shifting oversight, and institutional hot potato games where no agency wanted to hold the psychic program for too long. Over the course of 23 years, the program went through more name changes than a con artist on the run. So here is the timeline. From 1972 to 1977 was Scanate, run by the CIA out of Stanford Research Institute. This was the experimental phase, lab work, protocol development. Then, from 1977 to 1979, was Gondola Wish, which was under Army intelligence. The CIA handed it off, and it was the first signs that this is moving from research to operational testing. Now, from 1979 to 1983, it was known as Grill Flame, and that was under Army INSCOM. Now the program gets more serious and more structured. And from 1983 to 1986, it was referred to as Center Lane. It was the same oversight, new name, and the unit at Fort Meade solidified. From 1986 to 1990, it was referred to as Sunstreak, which was now under the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was fully operational, or at least it was supposed to be. And then from 1990 to 1995 was Project Stargate, and that was under DIA and then CIA for terminal evaluation, the final iteration. By this point, the program is running on fumes, essentially. The unit itself was actually notoriously small. It was never more than 15 to 20 people at any given time. And where did they work? It was not in some high-tech facility with psychic isolation chambers and holographic displays. They operated out of what one declassified document describes as an old, leaky wooden barracks at Fort Meade, Maryland. Wood floors that creaked, walls so thin you could hear conversations from the next room. This was the epicenter of America's psychic espionage program. But despite its humble physical appearance, the program was briefed at the highest levels of government. Semi-annual reports were provided to the Senate and House Select Committees. Members of Congress, people with oversight of the entire intelligence budget, were being briefed on psychic spies twice a year for over 2 decades. The program was classified as a Special Access Program, SAP designation, normally reserved for the most sensitive operations. And that classification served dual purposes. On one hand, it protected the program from being mocked out of existence. On the other hand, it meant that skeptics within the intelligence community couldn't easily audit or challenge it. The giggle factor, the absurdity of the whole enterprise, became both a shield and a cage. Because the topic was seen as too outlandish to take seriously, few officials wanted to be associated with it, either as supporters who looked like cranks or critics, or he'd be accused of wasting time attacking nonsense. So the program survived in kind of a institutional no man's land, funded but never fully embraced, tolerated but never trusted. So let's talk about the operational claims, the alleged hits that kept this thing alive through 6 name changes and 3 presidential administrations. Proponents of the program point to several high-profile successes. First was locating a downed Soviet aircraft in Africa. A remote viewer allegedly described the terrain, the wreckage, and the condition of the aircraft with enough accuracy that a recovery team was dispatched. Second, identifying a new class of Soviet submarine. A viewer allegedly sketched a Typhoon-class submarine's unique double-hull design before it was confirmed by satellite imagery. This is often cited as one of the 8 martini results, so startling that officials supposedly needed a drink to recover. Third, hostage locations in foreign military facilities. Declassified documents describe sessions where remote viewers were tasked with describing military installations, and some were rated as good or excellent on internal evaluation scales. Now, these stories are compelling, and they sound like the stuff of spy thrillers. And if they're true, the program should have been a massive success. But here is where the record gets a little more complicated. The 1995 evaluation commissioned by the CIA concluded that remote viewing had never provided actionable intelligence for any intelligence operation. Not once. Not in 23 years. Not in thousands of sessions. The report argued that information provided by the program was often vague and included irrelevant or erroneous data, and failed to offer specific details necessary for military planning. Even in the so-called dramatic hits, critics pointed to what they called sensory leakage, the possibility that viewers had more background information than advertised. That contaminated sessions that were supposed to be blind. A viewer describing a Soviet submarine, for instance, might have previously encountered technical drawings or news reports on similar vessels. The session would then reflect contaminated memory rather than psychic acquisition. The CIA's summary at termination was blunt. Remote viewing reports never provided actionable intelligence that could be independently verified and used for operational decisions. Which raises the central question of the entire program's history. If it was so useless, why did it last 23 years? Now, there are 3 potential reasons for that. First was the hard target problem. Satellites couldn't see underground bunkers. Closed Soviet cities were impenetrable. And remote viewing was always positioned as the workaround, the option that could theoretically go where no technology could follow. As long as hard targets existed, the program had a justification. Second was institutional survival via classification. The SAP designation shielded the program from rigorous scrutiny. It operated in a protected bubble. It was insulated from skeptics who would have dismantled it early. The giggle factor made it too embarrassing for anyone to want to deal with. And third, and this is the big one, was strategic insurance. Intelligence agencies operate under worst-case assumptions. If there was even a small chance that the Soviets were successful in using psychics to gather intelligence, then the US had to have its own capability just in case. This created a self-reinforcing psychic arms race. The existence of a US program justified a Soviet program, which justified the continuation of the US program, which justified the next budget cycle. It didn't matter if remote viewing actually worked. What mattered was that both sides believed the other side might have an advantage. And so the program limped along, year after year, name change after name change, funded but never quite trusted, operational but really never quite useful. Until 1995, when the CIA finally said enough. So let's go to May 22nd, 1984. This is the one. This is the document that, when it hit the internet, broke conspiracy brains wide open. The session cited in Ancient Aliens episodes, the transcript that convinced thousands of people that the CIA had confirmed the existence of an ancient Martian civilization. So let's talk about what actually happened and what didn't happen. May 22nd, 1984, in Fort Meade, Maryland. At that old wooden barracks, the room is quiet except for the hum of a tape recorder, and a remote viewing session is about to begin. The viewer, who is widely believed to be Joseph McMoneagle, though the declassified document doesn't name him, sits at a table. Across from him is the monitor. The monitor holds a sealed envelope, and the viewer doesn't know what's inside. The monitor doesn't know either, not yet. It is a double-blind experiment designed to eliminate any possibility of cueing or unconscious influence. The monitor opens the envelope, reads the target, and begins the session. Inside the envelope, coordinates and a time period. Mars, approximately 1 million years BC. Before we go any further, let's be clear about what this means. This isn't a request for intelligence on Soviet missile silos. This is an experimental target, a test of whether remote viewing can access not just distant places, but distant times, on another planet, a million years in the past. The monitor reads the first coordinate, 40.89 degrees north and 9.55 degrees west on Mars, and the session begins. The viewer reports seeing megalithic structures, pyramids, huge sections of smooth stone carved into canyon walls. The scale is massive. The landscape is desolate. Dust storms, a dying world. The monitor asks for more detail, and the viewer sketches. Lines on paper, geometric forms. Then the viewer describes an indigenous population. Very tall, thin beings who are facing an environmental catastrophe. The viewer says these beings are philosophical about their impending extinction. They're not panicking, they're not fighting, they're just kind of waiting. Some are in hibernation chambers, which are stasis units essentially, sealed inside structures designed to preserve them for an indefinite period. They're waiting for a scouting party that left the planet in search of a new home. The environmental crisis is described as a geologic problem. Severe dust storms, atmospheric corruption, a slow death. The monitor moves to another coordinate, and the viewer describes a very large road, unusual for normal traffic. Another area, chambers with strange, very rounded bottoms, ancient and purposeful. And then we really hit the strangest part of the session. The viewer claims to perceive these entities, not in words but in impressions, feelings of gestalt communication. The entities perceive the viewer as a hallucination. They're aware of his presence but don't fully understand it. They think he's the ghost, the phantom intruding on their reality. The viewer asks where they went, the scouting party, the ones who left. And the entities show him an image, a larger vessel traveling toward a world described as volatile and lush with vegetation. A description some interpret as prehistoric Earth. The session ends, the envelope is resealed, and the tape is archived. The document is filed among the program's experimental materials. So here is where interpretation begins. The declassified transcript is a psychic session record. It is not NASA data. It is not a scientific report about Mars. It is not an official CIA endorsement of ancient Martian civilizations. It's not proof of anything. The document is filed among experimental materials. There's no analytic conclusion endorsing the content as factual or operationally useful, and there's no follow-up analysis, no corroboration, no endorsement. But when this document was declassified and released through the CIA's Freedom of Information Act, the framing around it was anything but neutral. Headlines started appearing. CIA discovered an ancient Martian civilization. YouTube videos with titles like Leaked Government Confirms Aliens on Mars, Reddit threads dissecting every line of the transcript. That language, discovered, confirmed, leaked, came from commentators and media stories, not from the CIA's own evaluations. The CIA's actual position: this was an experiment, a test of remote viewing capabilities. It sits in the archive as a curiosity, not as proof of anything. The agency never claimed it was real, never used it in operational planning, and never said, yes, we believe this is an accurate account of ancient Mars. But critics of the session point out the obvious. The inability to verify data from 1 million years ago makes such sessions useless for scientific validation. There's no way to fact-check a remote viewing session about ancient Mars. No archaeological dig to confirm the pyramids, no geological survey to verify the dust storms. It's unfalsifiable, which means it's also scientifically worthless. But for proponents, this session is a cornerstone of the argument that remote viewing can access not just distant places, but distant times, and even make contact with non-human intelligence. It's cited as evidence that the Matrix contains data from all times and places, including the distant past of other worlds. In the years since declassification, the Mars session has become a central pillar in the expansion of Stargate lore into broader extraterrestrial contact narratives. The question isn't whether the Mars session is real. The question is whether it's verifiable. And the answer, according to the declassified record, is no. Which brings us to the people who believed it worked, the people who didn't, and the evaluation that finally pulled the plug. By the early 1990s, the Stargate program was on life support. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the strategic justification for a psychic intelligence unit was evaporating. So in 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institute for Research, the AIR, to conduct a comprehensive evaluation. The panel included two key figures: Jessica Utz, a statistician who had previously worked on parapsychology research, and Ray Hyman, a psychologist and prominent skeptic of paranormal claims. Their job was to answer two questions: is remote viewing scientifically valid according to standard methods, and does it have operational utility for intelligence? The resulting report is a masterclass in scientific disagreement. Utz argued that the laboratory results showed a statistically significant effect that could not be attributed to chance or flaws in experimental design. She maintained that the p-values across many experiments were so low that the existence of anomalous cognition should be considered well established by scientific standards, reaching levels as low as p less than 0.001 in some series. Her conclusion: some form of anomalous cognition exists. The lab data supports it. Hyman, on the other hand, argued that the statistical significance does not equate to proof of paranormal mechanism. He pointed out 4 critical problems. First, no independent replication. The findings had not been replicated in laboratories outside the parapsychological community. Second, the methodological issues. Blinding, queuing, data selection, and their interjudge reliability were all questionable in many studies. Third, sensory leakage. In some cases, viewers may have had more background information than advertised, undermining claims of pure psychic acquisition. Fourth, the lack of a positive theory. Parapsychologists relied on the failure to explain results through normal means rather than proving a specific paranormal mechanism. Hyman's conclusion: the effect might be an artifact of methodological flaws. Even if something anomalous is happening, it's not reliable or specific enough to be useful. The CIA's official verdict synthesized both views, and then went further than either evaluator intended. The AIR report concluded that laboratory studies showed some statistically significant deviations from chance in certain datasets, but did not convincingly establish a paranormal mechanism or rule out conventional explanations. Methodological issues made the positive findings fragile, and operationally, no remote viewing report had ever produced consistently actionable intelligence. The CIA's internal summary stated that these observations provided a compelling argument against continuation of the program within the intelligence community. In 1995, after approximately $20 million in total spending over 23 years, the CIA closed the program. But the termination didn't kill the debate. If anything, it intensified it. Supporters argue the 1995 review was biased, that the outcome was predetermined, and that evaluators used inconsistent criteria or ignored favorable data. Skeptics argue that the program lasted only because of institutional inertia, classification, and the, fun giggle factor. And both sides have a point. But here's what we actually know. The program existed, it was funded, it was briefed to Congress, it ran thousands of sessions, and its official conclusion was that it never had produced an actionable intelligence in 23 years. What we don't know, what the declassified record leaves genuinely open, is whether the lab results used to describe point towards something real, or whether Hyman's critique of the methodology simply means the effect was never there to begin with. The question remains unsolved, and that uncertainty is, in a sense, the program's most honest legacy. Now, if you thought the Mars session was the weirdest thing the Stargate achieved, we're just getting started. Because once the documents were declassified, once they hit the CIA's Freedom of Information Act reading room and started circulating online, they became a Rorschach test for conspiracy theories, New Age spirituality, and extraterrestrial contact narratives. People started connecting dots and finding patterns, building frameworks that link Stargate to everything from interdimensional travel to secret Mars bases to direct contact with the Galactic Federation. Some of this is documented in the declassified files. Some of it is creative interpretation. So let's walk through the three big ones and separate what's actually in the documents from what's been added later. First is the Gateway process. Now, the Gateway process was a training system developed by Robert Monroe and the Monroe Institute, which was a nonprofit organization focused on consciousness research. The Gateway process was not technically part of the Stargate unit. It was a separate program, but it was utilized by Army INSCOM personnel, and that was to alter consciousness and facilitate out-of-body experiences. So there is some overlap, personnel overlap, conceptual overlap. And when the CIA declassified a 1983 report on the Gateway experience, it landed directly in the middle of the Stargate conspiracy ecosystem. The technique at the core of Gateway is called hemisync, short for hemispheric synchronization. You use binaural beats, which are two slightly different audio frequencies played into each ear, to synchronize the hemispheres of the brain. The goal is to entrain the brain to produce specific brainwave outputs. Higher amplitude, higher frequency, altered states of consciousness. It's not just relaxation. The goal is to transcend normal limitations, to separate consciousness from the physical body. In 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonald wrote a report attempting to provide a scientific, or at least pseudo-scientific, explanation for the Gateway experience. And this is where things get interesting. McDonald's report dives into quantum mechanics and holographic theory. His conclusion: consciousness is a hologram that can transcend the restrictions of time and space. The universe itself, according to the report, is a holographic construct where consciousness is fundamentally non-local, not trapped inside the skull, not limited by the physical brain, but rather a field that can extend beyond the body and access information from across time and space. The Gateway process in this framework is a method for tuning consciousness like a radio dial. You synchronize your hemispheres, you enter a new state where the normal boundaries of perception dissolve. And in that state, according to the report, you can experience out-of-body travel across remote locations without physically moving. You can perceive events in the past or future and communicate with other consciousnesses. The report doesn't explicitly say this will let you talk to aliens, but it heavily implies that consciousness is not bound by the laws of physics as we understand them. And that is enough to fuel 1,000 different theories. The report also notes that the military's interest wasn't just curiosity. They wanted to know if altered states of consciousness could be used for intelligence gathering. If remote viewing was one method, perhaps out-of-body experiences were another. Perhaps the two could be combined. The Gateway report suggests that the military was interested not just in seeing targets, but in the fundamental nature of reality itself. Then we move on to Ingo Swann and the moon. So let's talk a little bit about Ingo Swann, who was the father of remote viewing, the guy who designed the protocols. He was the original psychic spy. In 1998, 3 years after Stargate was officially terminated, Swann published a book called Penetration: The Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. And in that book, he made a claim that sent shockwaves through the UFO and remote viewing communities. Swann claimed that in 1975, he was hired by a mysterious government contact to conduct a series of remote viewing sessions targeting the dark side of the moon. Not the near side, but the far side, the hemisphere that's permanently turned away from us. And what did he see? Massive towers, roads, structures that looked artificial, and humanoid beings engaged in industrial activities. According to Swann, the moon isn't a dead rock, it is inhabited, and the beings living there are aware of human surveillance. In his book, he describes moments where the entities seem to notice him, to perceive his remote viewing presence and react to it. But here is the problem. There's no declassified corroboration for this story. No CIA documents confirming the tasking. The claim only exists in Swann's book and in his later interviews. But that hasn't stopped it from becoming a cornerstone of the conspiracy culture surrounding the program. Supporters cite Swann's credentials. He wasn't a random New Age guru. He was a trained researcher and the person who designed the protocols used by the military. They also cite his alleged success in remote viewing Jupiter's rings before they were confirmed by Voyager 1. Skeptics call it educated guessing. Jupiter is a gas giant, and it's not unreasonable to hypothesize rings. But for believers, the Jupiter confirmation is proof. And if he was right about Jupiter, why not the moon? And then next is the Galactic Federation. So we fast forward to December 2020. The pandemic is raging, the world is locked down, and then, out of nowhere, Haim Eshed, the former head of Israel's space security program, gives an interview to an Israeli newspaper and says something that sounds like science fiction. A galactic federation has been in contact with the United States and Israeli governments for years. There is a secret underground base on Mars where human representatives and aliens collaborate to understand the fabric of the universe. Extraterrestrials are waiting for humanity to evolve before revealing their presence. World leaders have been aware of this contact for decades. Eshed didn't provide documents, he didn't name names, but he was a credentialed military official, someone who had held one of Israel's highest defense positions. And here is where that ties back to Stargate. The terminology Eshed used, and that subsequent whistleblowers have echoed, often mirrors concepts explored in the program. The idea of a matrix of information accessible to consciousness, the use of remote viewing to contact non-human intelligence, the notion that advanced beings are monitoring humanity. And then there's this, a session summary from January 1988, declassified as part of the Stargate archive, lists Galactic Federation HQS as a site target. The document describes a round structure on top of a flat mesa. No context, no explanation, just a coordinate target with that specific name. Does this prove the US government was in contact with a galactic federation? No. It proves that someone at some point tasked a remote viewer with a target labeled that. Now, whether that was a serious operational target, a test, or something else entirely is unknown. The declassified record contains no evidence that Stargate was centrally integrated with UFO research programs, or that it yielded secret confirmation of extraterrestrial craft. That link is cultural and personnel-based, not programmatic. But the fact that these narratives exist tells you something about how declassification works in the internet age. Once the files are out there, they become raw material for anyone with a theory. You find a document that says Galactic Federation HQS, and if you're already inclined to believe that aliens are real and the government is hiding it, that document becomes proof. Never mind any lack of context. The document exists, and that is enough. Now, one of the underreported aspects of the Stargate story is the internal conflict among its most famous members. The program wasn't just fighting skeptics on the outside. It was dealing with personality clashes and inflated egos and conflicting testimonies from within. Ed Dames, a former monitor and trainer, became one of the program's most sensationalist public figures after its termination. He made bold claims: impending catastrophes, including solar killshots, alien bases on Earth, and predicted a disclosure event called the Big Event, predicted for August 1993. That didn't happen. Joseph McMoneagle, one of the longest-serving viewers, frequently refuted Dames' version of events. McMoneagle noted that Dames served as a monitor and interviewer during his military tenure, not the operations officer with the complete picture that Dames claimed to be. Dames' predictions consistently failed to materialize, leading to persistent criticism that he was using the program's legacy for personal commercial gain. Then there's David Morehouse, who's author of The Psychic Warrior, who claimed that the government used remote viewing for remote influencing, a form of psychokinesis intended to harm people or equipment. This claim was met with skepticism from other unit members who argued that Morehouse was sensationalizing the program's actual work. Critics noted what they called a New Age kitchen sink ontology in Morehouse's accounts. He conflated conventional intelligence gathering with visiting an inhabited Mars of 1 million years BC, leading other veterans of the program to question the rigor of his claims. The takeaway here is significant. Even among the people who were actually in the program, there's no consensus on what was real and what was embellishment. The declassified record is incomplete, the memories are contested, and the incentives, book deals, speaking circuits, documentary appearances, have in many cases pointed in the direction of a more dramatic story rather than a more accurate one, and that should inform how we read all of it. The Stargate program officially ended in 1995, but the questions it raised haven't gone anywhere. In the years since declassification, the documents have been absorbed into broader narratives that the program's architects never intended. Ancient Aliens episodes cite the Mars session as proof of extraterrestrial contact. The Galactic Federation session summary circulates as evidence of secret diplomacy, and Ingleswan's moon-based claims appear in forums alongside satellite imagery analysis and whistleblower testimony. The program that ended has become something larger than itself, a mythology, a permission structure for the idea that the government knows more than it's saying. And then there's this, which shouldn't be forgotten. In 2019, OpenAI, which is backed by billions in corporate investment and the stated goal of developing artificial general intelligence, announced a flagship infrastructure initiative, and they called it Stargate. Same name, same promise of transcendence, same belief that if you invest enough resources, you can push human perception beyond its current limits. The CIA was chasing that promise with pencils and sealed envelopes in a leaky wooden barracks. Now it's being chased with tensor processing units and data centers the size of city blocks. The frame has changed, the ambition hasn't. But here's what still doesn't sit right. 23 years, $20 million, semi-annual Senate briefings, high-level interest from people with physics PhDs and top-secret clearances, 6 different program names, 3 different agencies. The official explanation for all of this is strategic insurance, institutional inertia, the giggle factor that made it easier to fund the program quietly than to fight the bureaucracy required to shut it down. And those explanations are probably mostly correct, but there's another possibility, one the declassified files don't quite rule out. Maybe there were enough results, not proof, not operationally decisive intelligence, not enough to stake a mission on, but enough anomalies, enough sessions that landed in ways that made serious people pause, enough moments where the signal seemed to break through the noise. that terminating the program felt like a gamble. Because in intelligence, you don't need certainty, you just need doubt. And Project Stargate left a lot of doubt. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode on Project Stargate. I hope you liked it. This one is something that I've wanted to do for a while. Every time I post anything online about government programs or anything like that, I get so many people talking about remote viewing and Stargate and all that. And I thought it was time to do an episode on it. And it's interesting because to me, why spend the money and that much time and that much reorganization into different program names and all that for nothing, for a joke, for something that didn't make any sense? That is wild to me. And then the fact that, Ingo Swann's descriptions of the moon. Now, I don't think there's a civilization on the far side of the moon. But that being said, yes, they've declassified documents, but we've seen over and over and over again, especially recently, that declassified documents don't necessarily mean anything. There's other documents we don't have. There's redacted documents. There's a lot of information that we're not being told. So how much more truth is out there about this stuff that we don't know? Now, I think there's something to the Stargate program. I don't know if remote viewing in and of itself is essentially real, but I think there's something to this. They wouldn't have spent this much time and money on something that was just nothing. So there is something to it. I don't think it's as accurate as being able to depict a galactic federation and contact aliens, but I think people can see things that we don't understand. I think there is this greater consciousness that people can connect to that we're not really aware of. There is more to this stuff. And what that actually means is really the greater question we should be asking. So again, thank you guys for listening. If you like this episode, please leave a rating, leave a review, share the show. It really goes a long way to grow the show. Word of mouth is the best advertisement we could ever ask for. So please rate the show, share the show, leave a comment. It really does everything for us. Check out the social medias, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Paranormal Directive 13. And if you've been paying attention, now I use Acast to host my podcast, and Acast and YouTube do not play nice with each other. So up until recently, the full episodes of the podcast have not been available on YouTube. Now, I found a program, it's called Headliner, and it turns my podcast episodes into an audiogram. So you get an equalizer bar and all that, so I can turn it into a video. I have been uploading every single episode of the backlog to YouTube. So every single episode, one episode a day until we're caught up. And then, of course, the new episodes are going to go live when they go live on the podcast. So we're not going to miss the new stuff, but all of the old episodes are going to be uploaded one episode a day until we're caught up. So if you do prefer YouTube, or you know someone who prefers YouTube and doesn't want to use podcast apps, send them over to the Paranormal Directive 13 YouTube, because now finally we can listen to all the episodes on YouTube as well. So check that out, and thank you guys so much, and tune in next week. And remember, we don't always need concrete proof. Sometimes all we need is a little bit of doubt.